The cargo bay of the merchant vessel Cosmic Dawn hummed with the steady rhythm of recycling processors and atmospheric regulators. Commander Jackson Vale moved through his routine security sweep with practiced efficiency, his boots echoing softly against the metal deck plates. After 15 years in space security, he had learned to notice the small details that others missed, the subtle changes in air circulation, the faint sounds that didn't belong, the shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. It was one such shadow that caught his attention near the waste processing unit. A flicker of movement where there should have been none, a barely perceptible shift in the darkness that spoke of something alive and hiding. "Hello?" Jackson called softly, his hand moving instinctively to rest on his sidearm, not to draw it, but to ensure it remained holstered. His training had taught him that most problems could be solved with patience rather than force. The shadow stilled completely, as if whatever lurked there hoped that perfect stillness might render it invisible. Jackson crouched down slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim lighting. What he saw made his heart clench with unexpected emotion. A child sat huddled between the machinery, knees drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around her legs. Her skin held the distinctive midnight blue coloration of the Astari people, marked with the constellation patterns that should have glowed with stellar energy. Instead, the star-like markings appeared dull and lifeless against her dark skin. Her hair, which should have shimmered like captured starlight, hung lank and dirty around her thin face. Most striking were her eyes, large silver orbs that watched him with the wary intelligence of someone far older than her apparent age. Those eyes held depths of pain and resignation that no child should possess. "Hey there, little star," Jackson said gently, using the common endearment for Astari children. "I'm Jackson. What's your name?" The child's grip tightened around her legs, but she didn't flee. Instead, she studied his face with careful attention. As if trying to determine whether he represented safety or danger, she whispered finally, her voice carrying the musical quality of her people despite being roughened by dehydration and fear. "Nix Stellaris." Jackson smiled warmly at the beautiful name. Nix Stellaris. That's a name fit for a princess of the stars. He noticed how her silver eyes widened slightly at his words, confusion replacing some of the wariness. "I'm not a princess," she said quietly. "I'm defective. My family said so." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this devastating statement hit Jackson like a physical blow. He had encountered many forms of cruelty during his career, but the casual dismissal of a child's worth never failed to ignite his protective instincts. "Well," Jackson said carefully, settling more comfortably on the deck, "I think your family might be wrong about that. Would you like some clean water? You look thirsty?" He reached slowly into his utility belt and withdrew a sealed water packet, placing it on the floor between them rather than trying to hand it to her directly. The gesture of respect for her boundaries seemed to surprise her almost as much as his earlier compliment. Nix stared at the water packet as if it might disappear if she looked away. Her small hand reached out tentatively, then pulled back, then reached out again, when she finally grasped the packet and managed to open it. She drank with the desperate thirst of someone who had been surviving on condensation and wastewater. "When did you last eat?" Jackson asked gently. Nix's gaze dropped. To the deck? Around her hiding spot, Jackson could see the evidence of her survival: empty food containers pulled from waste bins, scraps of discarded meals, and the remnants of packaging that other crew members had thrown away. "The crew doesn't like sharing with broken ones," she said simply. "Starry, without proper starlight, are just empty shells taking up space." Jackson felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm and warm. "I don't see anything broken about you, Princess Nix. I see someone who's been surviving on her own, which takes incredible strength and intelligence." For the first time since he'd found her, a tiny spark seemed to kindle in those silver eyes. It wasn't hope yet, that would take time, but it was the first crack in the wall of despair that surrounded her. Standing slowly, Jackson extended his hand toward her with infinite patience. "What do you say we get you some real food and a proper place to rest? Princesses shouldn't have to live in shadows." After a long moment of internal struggle, Nix placed her small, trembling hand in his larger one. As they walked together toward the crew quarters, Jackson realized that his routine security patrol had just become the most important mission of his career. Dr. Mira Thorne had seen many wounded souls pass through her medical bay during her 23 years as a ship's physician. But none had affected her quite like the small Astari child that Commander Vale brought to her 3 days ago. Perched on the edge of the examination table, her legs swinging freely as she watched Mira organize medical supplies with intense curiosity, the transformation had already begun. Clean clothes replaced the tattered rags. Regular meals were filling out her gaunt frame, and most importantly, the dull constellation patterns on her skin had started to show faint glimmers of light. Not the brilliant stellar radiance expected of healthy Astari children, but a soft warm glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her emotions. "The bioluminescence is returning," Mira observed, running her medical scanner over Nix's arm. "Your people's stellar energy patterns are fascinating. Most medical texts describe them as purely genetic expressions, but I'm seeing something different. In your readings," Nix tilted her head with that peculiar intensity she brought to all new information. "Different how?" "My birth family said my patterns were proof of genetic failure. Too dim, too weak to channel proper starlight." Mira paused in her scans, struck by how the child could discuss her abandonment with such clinical detachment. It spoke. "Too psychological trauma that went far deeper than physical neglect? What if I told you that your patterns aren't weak, they're just tuned to a different frequency?" Mira said carefully. "Look at this." She turned her scanner's display toward Nix, showing wavelength patterns that danced across the small screen. Normal Astari emits stellar energy in the blue-white spectrum, used for powering technology and creating light constructs. But your patterns show emissions in the infrared range. Infrared. Nix leaned forward, her silver eyes brightening with genuine interest for the first time since arriving on the ship. "Heat signatures, emotional resonance, life force detection," Mira explained, pulling up comparative data on her medical tablet. "Yesterday, when Engineer Korvac was working on the fusion reactor, you told Commander Vale that the man was burning with worry inside. Korvac hadn't told anyone about his concerns over the reactor's stability, but you sensed his emotional state through thermal patterns that most beings can't detect." Nix stared at the data displays with growing wonder. "I can feel when people are sad or angry or afraid. The heat changes around them. I thought everyone could sense that." "Not everyone, little star," Mira said gently, borrowing Jackson's endearment. "For the child, what you have is a form of empathic thermogenesis, the ability to read emotional states through biological heat signatures. It's incredibly rare, even among telepathic species." The constellation patterns on Nix's arms pulsed, brighter, responding to her excitement and growing sense of self-worth. "But it's not what Astari children are supposed to have. Doesn't power ships or create weapons or build cities from starlight." Mira knelt down to bring herself to Nix's eye level, her expression serious but warm. "Sweetheart, what if your people have been measuring worth with the wrong tools? What if they're so focused on raw power that they can't see other forms of strength?" "Commander Vale says similar things," Nix admitted quietly. "He calls me princess, even though I don't understand why." "Because," Mira said with gentle conviction, "royalty isn't determined by the expectations others place on you. It comes from the nobility of your spirit, the kindness in your heart, and the unique gifts you bring to the world. Your thermal empathy is not just rare, Nix, it's precious. You can sense pain before it becomes visible, detect lies through emotional heat patterns, and offer comfort to people who don't even realize they need it." Nix was quiet for a long moment, processing this radical reframing of her abilities. "Dr. Thorne," she said finally, "do you really think there's nothing wrong with me?" "Oh, little star," Mira said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think you're exactly who you're supposed to be. And anyone who couldn't see that was blind to their own good fortune." For the first time since arriving on the cosmic dawn, Nix smiled, a real smile that made her constellation patterns flare with genuine stellar radiance. The light wasn't the expected blue-white of traditional Astari power, but a warm golden glow that seemed to fill the medical bay with hope and possibility. As Mira watched the child's unique light push back the shadows, She realized that sometimes healing meant more than repairing physical damage. Sometimes it meant helping someone discover that they had never been broken in the first place. Professor Ezrin Blackwood had spent 40 years teaching xenobiology and comparative cultures at the Galactic Academic Institute before retiring to a quiet life aboard merchant vessels, trading his knowledge for passage between the stars. Had never expected his most important student to be a 7-year-old Astari, child with eyes like liquid silver and a hunger for learning that reminded him why he had become an educator in the first place. The Astari Empire spans 14 star systems, Nyx recited, her small finger tracing constellations on the holographic star map that Professor Blackwood had projected above his desk. Primary energy source is stellar collection and manipulation. Through biological luminescence patterns, social hierarchy determined by power output, and spectrum purity. Textbook perfect, Ezrin said with approval, though his weathered face showed concern at how mechanically she delivered the information. Now tell me what you think about that social structure. NYX's finger paused in its tracing. Days aboard the Cosmic Dawn, she had begun to fill out from regular meals, and her constellation patterns now glowed with steady warmth, rather than the dim flickers he had first observed. But her emotional responses still carried the caution of someone who had learned that wrong answers could have painful consequences. I think she said carefully that it makes practical sense. Stronger individuals contribute more to society's energy needs. Weak ones consume resources without adequate return. Ezrin leaned back in his chair, stroking his graying beard thoughtfully. That's what your birth culture taught you. But I asked what you think, not what you've been told to think. The distinction seemed to confuse her. Aren't they the same thing? Not at all, my dear student, Ezrin said gently. Thinking means examining ideas, questioning assumptions, forming your own conclusions based on evidence and experience. Let me ask you this. In the past 12 days, what have you contributed to this ship's crew? Nyx's silver eyes widened with something approaching panic. I haven't contributed anything. I consume food and water and take up space in Commander Vale's quarters? I'm just a burden that everyone is too kind to mention. Interesting hypothesis, Ezrin said with the measured tone he had perfected during decades of guiding students toward better thinking. Let's examine the evidence. Yesterday, you warned Dr. Thorne that Engineer Korvac was developing a fever before he showed any visible symptoms. How did that help the ship? Dr. Thorne was able to treat his illness before it became serious, Nyx admitted reluctantly. But that was just sensing his thermal patterns. It's not a useful skill. Engineer Korvac is our only qualified fusion specialist, Ezrin pointed out. If his illness had progressed, we could have faced reactor failure in deep space. Your early warning potentially saved all our lives. Is that not useful? Nyx's constellation patterns flickered with uncertainty as she processed this perspective. I hadn't thought about it that way. 3 days ago, you noticed that Supply Officer Hendricks was experiencing elevated stress patterns and suggested to Commander Vale that she might need help with inventory management. When Vale checked, he discovered she had been covering for a crew member's mistakes to avoid getting him in trouble, working double shifts and making errors due to exhaustion. Your observation prevented potential supply shortages and helped resolve a personnel issue. Was that not valuable? But those are just noticing things, Nyx protested, though her voice carried less conviction than before. Ezrin pulled up another holographic display, this one showing a complex mathematical equation. Can you solve this stellar navigation calculation? Nyx studied the display for several minutes, her young face scrunched in concentration. I don't have the advanced mathematics background, she admitted finally. Neither do most adults, Ezrin said kindly. But you can sense emotional distress patterns that our most sophisticated medical scanners miss. You can detect deception through thermal variations that our security systems can't identify. You can predict behavioral changes based on biological cues that trained psychologists overlook. These are forms of intelligence, Nyx. They're just not the forms that a starry culture has chosen to value. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Let me tell you something I learned during 4 decades of teaching. Brilliant minds from across the galaxy. Intelligence comes in countless forms. Wisdom, empathy, pattern recognition, creative problem solving, emotional insight. These are all types of intelligence. Some cultures prize mathematical ability, others value artistic expression, still others focus on physical prowess or psychic power. But intelligence itself transcends any single culture's definition. Nyx was quiet for a long moment, her constellation patterns pulsing with the rhythm of deep thought. "Professor Blackwood," she said finally, "do you really think I'm intelligent?" "Dear child," Ezran said with warm conviction, "I think you're brilliant. Your mind works in ways that could revolutionize how we understand interspecies, communication, and emotional intelligence. The fact that your birth culture couldn't recognize your gifts says nothing about your worth and everything about the limitations of their perspective." The smile that spread across Nyx's face was radiant, her stellar patterns flaring with genuine joy for the first time since he had begun working with her. In that moment, Ezran saw not a discarded child marked as defective, but a young scholar beginning to understand her own potential. "Now then," he said with renewed energy, "shall we continue your education, Princess Nyx? We have galaxies of knowledge to explore together." The cosmic dawn shuddered slightly as the Astari enforcement vessel locked onto their hull with tractor beams, forcing them out of hyperspace 3 days ahead of their scheduled arrival at Kepler Station. Captain Rosa Wyndham stood on her bridge, watching through the main view screen as the sleek, predatory lines of the Astari ship's stellar judgment maneuvered alongside her merchant vessel with military precision. Captain Communications Officer Park reported from his station, "We're receiving a priority boarding request from Astari Imperial Authority. They're claiming salvage rights on escaped genetic material." Rosa felt her stomach drop. In the month since Commander Vale had brought little Nyx aboard, the child had become beloved by the entire crew. Her gentle empathy and eager curiosity had brightened their routine journeys in ways that none of them had fully appreciated until it happened. The thought of handing her over to authorities who viewed her as defective property made Rosa's command training war with her basic human decency. "Tell them we'll need to see proper documentation," Rosa said, buying time while her mind raced through legal options. "And get Vale up here immediately." The airlock cycled open 20 minutes later, admitting 3 figures in the flowing ceremonial robes of Astari Imperial Authority. The leader, a tall woman with brilliant constellation patterns that pulsed with cold stellar fire, surveyed the bridge with the disdainful expression of someone forced to deal with inferior life forms. "I am Inquisitor Zara, Nightfall of the Genetic Purity Enforcement Division," she announced, her voice carrying the musical quality of her people, but twisted into something sharp and threatening. "We are here to reclaim stolen Astari genetic material designated as experimental subject NYX 7749. Subject." Rosa stepped forward, her captain's authority radiating from every line of her posture. "We have a child aboard named Nyx Stellaris. Not experimental material, a person." Zara's constellation patterns flared with what might have been amusement. The specimen was classified as genetically defective and scheduled for beneficial disposal. It's unauthorized departure from processing facilities constitutes theft of Imperial resources. "Beneficial disposal," Commander Vale said as he entered the bridge, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Is that what you call abandoning a 7-year-old child to die alone? Defective specimens consume resources without providing adequate genetic return," Zara replied with bureaucratic coldness. "Disposal prevents contamination of healthy bloodlines and eliminates unnecessary resource drain. The specimen's survival indicates insufficient processing protocols, which we intend to correct." Dr. Thorne's voice crackled over the bridge intercom, thick with emotion. "Captain Nyx is hiding in the medical bay's storage compartment. She's terrified. Her thermal empathy is picking up their emotional states. She says they're excited about causing pain." Rosa saw Zara's constellation patterns brighten with predatory satisfaction at this information. "Thermal empathy," the Inquisitor mused. "An interesting mutation. Our research facilities will find excellent use for such aberrant capabilities." "Research facilities," Vale repeated, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "You mean torture chambers? Call them genetic?" "Optimization laboratories," Zara said with mock patience. "The specimen's unusual neural patterns will provide valuable data for preventing similar mutations in future generations." Its contribution to Imperial science will finally give its existence some small measure of worth. Professor Blackwood's voice joined the intercom conversation from his quarters. Captain, I've been reviewing galactic salvage law and Astari citizenship regulations. There may be legal precedents we can invoke. Relevant, Zara snapped, her musical voice turning harsh. Imperial authority supersedes colonial legal frameworks. The specimen will be transferred to our custody within the hour, or we will classify this vessel as harboring stolen Imperial property and respond accordingly. Rosa glanced at her bridge crew, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. Communications Officer Park gave her a subtle nod. Engineering Chief Torres flexed his fingers over his control console. Even elderly Navigator Webb straightened. In his chair with military bearing that hadn't been visible since his retirement from active service, Inquisitor Nightfall, Rosa said with quiet steel in her voice, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Nixtellaris is not cargo to be transferred. She's a member of my crew under the protection of merchant vessel regulations and interspecies civil rights accords. Zara's constellation patterns flared with dangerous fire. You would risk your ship and crew for the sake of genetic refuse. I would risk everything, Rosa replied without hesitation. To protect a child who has shown more honor and nobility in 1 month than you've displayed in this entire conversation. The bridge fell silent, except for the steady hum of life support systems. Through that silence, a small voice crackled over the intercom. Nix herself, speaking from her hiding place with a courage that made Rosa's heart swell with pride. Captain Wyndham, Nix said, her young voice steady, despite her fear. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me. If they want to take me, maybe Princess, Vale interrupted firmly. We've discussed this, your crew, and we protect our crew. Always. Rosa smiled fiercely as she faced down the Astari Inquisitor. You heard him, Nightfall? Nix isn't going anywhere. The constellation patterns on Zara's skin began to pulse with the rhythm of gathering stellar energy, and Rosa realized that diplomacy was about to give way to something far more dangerous. The standoff lasted exactly 37 seconds before Inquisitor Zara Nightfall raised her hands. Stellar energy crackling between her fingers like captured lightning. Her constellation patterns blazed with the cold fire of distant stars as she prepared to demonstrate why the Astari Empire had conquered 14 star systems through superior force rather than diplomacy. Final warning, Captain Wyndham, Zara said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the bridge's metal surfaces ring like struck bells. Surrender the defective specimen, or face the consequences of harboring Imperial property. Rosa Wyndham stood her ground, flanked by her bridge crew who had chosen loyalty over safety without hesitation. Commander Vale's hand rested on his sidearm. Though they all knew that conventional weapons would be useless against Astar stellar manipulation, Dr. Thorne continued her quiet encouragement over the intercom to Nix, who remained hidden in the medical bay storage compartment. It was Professor Blackwood's voice that cut through the tension with unexpected authority. Inquisitor Nightfall, he said, his academic tone carrying across the bridge, intercom with calm certainty. I believe you should examine these legal documents before taking any irreversible action. Academic interference will not, Zara began, then stopped as her personal data pad chimed with an incoming file transfer. Her constellation patterns flickered with confusion as she scanned the transmitted information. Galactic Civilian Protection Accord, Article 847, Professor Blackwood continued in his lecturer's voice. Any sentient being who demonstrates autonomous decision-making and contributes meaningful service to a registered civilian vessel may claim citizenship protection under interspecies law, regardless of origin. Species internal classifications irrelevant. Legal maneuvering, Zara snapped, though uncertainty began to creep into her voice. Psst. The specimen lacks the cognitive development for autonomous decisions. On the contrary, came a new voice over the intercom. Nix herself, speaking with a quiet dignity that made everyone on the bridge straighten with surprise. I formally request civilian protection under Article 847 of the Galactic Civilian Protection Accord. I claim citizenship aboard the merchant vessel Cosmic Dawn based on my contributions to crew safety and ship operations over the past month. Zara's stellar energy flickered as her bureaucratic mind processed this unexpected development. Child. Cannot Dr. Thorne, Nix continued with growing confidence, please display my medical contributions to ship security? The main view screen activated, showing detailed medical logs of Nix's early warning system that had prevented illness outbreaks, identified equipment stress before failures occurred, and detected personnel conflicts before they escalated to dangerous levels. Her thermal empathy had quite literally saved lives and prevented disasters. Engineering Chief Torres, Nix continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. Please confirm my assistance with environmental systems monitoring. More data flowed across the screen instances where Nix's ability to sense thermal irregularities had identified failing environmental processors, overheating conduits, and energy distribution problems that standard sensors had missed. Her unique perception had prevented potentially catastrophic system failures. Professor Blackwood, please present my educational progress and cognitive development assessments. Academic evaluations appeared, showing learning curves that exceeded adult baseline performance in multiple areas of interspecies communication, cultural analysis, and environmental pattern recognition. The data painted a picture not of a defective child, but of a remarkably gifted individual whose abilities had been misunderstood by her birth culture. Inquisitor Zara stared at the accumulating evidence with growing alarm. Her constellation patterns dimmed as the legal implications became clear. If an Astari civilian court reviewed this case, they might be forced to acknowledge that their genetic classification system had made a catastrophic error. This is fraud, she declared desperately. Manufactured evidence to support illegal harboring of Imperial property. Actually, Captain Wyndham said with quiet satisfaction. It's documentation of why Nix Stellaris has earned her place among my crew through merit, contribution, and demonstrated value. She's not property, Inquisitor. She's a citizen of this ship, with all the legal protections that status provides. From the medical bay, Nix's voice carried a new note of strength and self-assurance. Inquisitor Nightfall, I understand that my abilities don't match what Astari culture expects from its children.
Oh!
But I've learned that worth isn't determined by other people's measurements. My thermal empathy, my pattern recognition, my ability to sense emotional distress, these aren't genetic defects. They're different forms of intelligence that have value in their own right. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had finally understood her own worth. I choose to remain with people who see my gifts rather than my limitations. I choose to stay where I'm valued for who I am, not condemned for who I'm not. The constellation. Patterns on Zara's skin flickered and dimmed as the full implications of the situation became clear. Her mission to retrieve defective genetic material had transformed into a potential interstellar incident involving citizens' rights, legal citizenship, and documented proof of individual worth. This matter is not concluded, she said finally, her musical voice tight with frustrated authority. The Empire will review these ... developments. As the Astari enforcement team departed, Rosa turned to her crew with fierce pride. Well done, everyone. Nix, you can come out now. You're safe. When the young Astari child emerged from her hiding place, her constellation patterns blazed with the warm golden light of stellar fire, not the cold blue radiance of traditional Astari power, but something entirely her own. She stood tall, her silver eyes bright with newfound confidence, and for the first time since boarding the Cosmic Dawn, she truly looked like the princess that Commander Vale had always insisted she was. Thank you, Nix, said simply addressing the entire crew who had risked everything to protect her. All of you helped me understand something important. I was never broken. I was just surrounded by people who couldn't see my crown. Professor Blackwood smiled with academic satisfaction. And now, my dear Princess Nix, your real education begins learning to rule the kingdom of your own potential. The Cosmic Dawn. Resumed course toward Kepler Station, Nix Stellaris stood on the observation deck, watching distant stars wheel past the viewports. Her constellation patterns pulsed with warm, steady light, the radiance not of traditional Astari power, but of someone who had finally learned to see herself as others saw her, not as discarded genetic material, but as royalty who had simply been waiting for the right kingdom to call home.